Welcome back to Spring Into Math 5. I'm Mr. Stein. Today we're going to wrap up Chapter 10 with a review, and then we're going to break this into two parts because it's kind of long. So we're going to tackle Part 1 now. Okay, so let's take a look. The first thing we talked about in this chapter is 2- and 3-dimensional figures. And this was really important because we really took this knowledge and then we used it to figure out volume. So we're going to kind of review all those different 3-dimensional shapes. Okay, so let's discuss the difference between a 2-dimensional figure and a 3-dimensional figure. So you've learned about figures that are 2-dimensional. These include rectangles, squares, triangles, pentagons, trapezoids, and any parallelogram. And obviously there's going to be others, but those are really the main ones you're going to see. So 2-dimensional figures are plane figures, and we often think of them as flat figures. So a plane figure does not have any other dimensions to it. It's just flat. All right, so remember, it doesn't have any depth. Okay, so here's some of your common plane figures. Okay, they're plane figures or 2-dimensional figures. You have a circle, a triangle, and a rectangle. Okay, if you're looking at them, remember there's no depth to them, they're just flat on the page. Okay, so we also have 3-dimensional figures, and that's really the focus of this lesson and this review, is they're also known as solid figures. So solid figures aren't created on one plane, they have depth to them. So let's classify some of them. Okay, first we have prisms. So a prism is a figure that has two parallel congruent bases. Remember, congruent's the same. The bases can be any polygon. Here's an example of a prism that you're all familiar with. Okay, so there's your typical prism. Notice that the two bases on the top and on the bottom are both squares. They're both the same. Okay, so that particular prism is a cube. So this is another cube, and this cube is a type of a prism like we talked about. Notice that the two bases of the cube are squares. Now, once it's a square, obviously all the sides are going to be squares, but really you're primarily focusing in on the bases. Okay, next let's talk triangular prism. So notice that the two bases are triangles. Now, it's a little bit tricky to see in this picture. I mean, you don't think of them as bases, but you have two triangles on either side. Now, really you'd flip it maybe to the other side if you were trying to make it really look like it was the bases, but you have two triangles essentially. Okay? Also, we have cylinders, and these are common in everyday life as well. A cylinder has two bases that are circles. Now, here's the tricky part. If you remember, I previewed that you're going to learn this in 6th grade, and I know because I'm the guy doing the videos on that, and it's a little complicated, but the thing to think about is that a rectangle is wrapped around the bases forming the center. So it's kind of a weird concept, but if you think about it, when you look at it open, you know, that net figure, it's like two circles and you got a weird kind of rectangle there. But when you look at it in 3 dimension, it looks very similar. You're used to it. It's a can of soup. It's just a cylinder. You see cylinders in everyday life all the time. Yeah, we also have pyramids. A pyramid has one polygon as a base, and the sides are triangular faces that all connect at one vertex at the top. Okay, so think of the Egyptian pyramids. That's the one that everyone thinks about. Okay, you can't really tell from the picture, but the base is a square and all the faces are triangles, and they meet at one vertex. So if you look at this one, it's really kind of obviously a much simpler version of that square pyramid, like the Egyptian pyramids. Much easier to see. You have the square at the base and you have your triangles all coming together to meet one vertex at the top. Okay, we also have a cone. A cone has one circular base, and the sides of the cone meet in one vertex at the top. So you can see that the sides are one piece that is wrapped around the circular base, forming a single vertex. Okay, so you can see here my visual of the cone. Okay, we also have a sphere. A sphere has a set of connected points located around one center point, kind of a weird concept. So while circular in form, it's also 3-dimensional. Think of a ball. A ball is a sphere. So you can see one right there. You can see how it kind of, when they draw a sphere trying to make it 3-dimensional, you always have those kind of lines around both sides. Typically, if I'm just going to draw one, I'll try my best here. If I just draw a circle, if I'm just going to draw a sphere, I just do one line like that across the side to kind of give it some depth. Okay, so now let's talk faces, edges, and vertices. Okay, so we've learned about the different kinds of solid figures or 3-dimensional objects. Now we're going to take it a step further and learn the parts of a 3-dimensional object. Okay, so solid figures have their own characteristics, like plane figures do. So if I just bought a new cell phone, the picture of the box it came in, right? And you think about it, you can look at some of the common shapes. So do you know what shape this base of the figure is? And hopefully, you know, if I slide back, you can see, well, it's a rectangle. Okay, so now you know how to identify some solids. You need to look at how they're how they look to make sure you can classify them specifically. So to do this, let's look at the features of a solid figure. So the number of faces, edges, and vertices of a solid figure tells us what kind of figure it is, what kind of solid figure it is. So you can use this information to classify solids. So we classify or identify them by the number of each that they have. So let's begin by looking at faces. So a table is a three-dimensional figure. We discussed this before. So if you put your hand on top of a table, okay, you're touching the face of a three-dimensional figure. So a face is a flat side of a solid figure. Okay, faces are in the form of plane shapes, such as triangles, rectangles, and squares. So take a look at the faces highlighted in this figure. Okay, so you can see they're different colors, but they're all flat surfaces. Okay, every solid figure has several faces. We can count the number of faces the figure has. So how many faces can you count on the cell phone box? Okay, so if you look at it, it has 6 faces. So you have one on the top and on the bottom, and then you have the 4 around the sides connecting them. All right, so what shape are the faces? Well, they're rectangles. So therefore, we call this figure a rectangular prism. So now let's look at another one. Okay, again, we have a square at the bottom of our pyramid, so it's called a square pyramid. There's also a triangular pyramid, which would have a triangle at the bottom. Okay, so now that you understand faces, let's look at edges. We can also identify a solid figure by counting the edges. An edge is the place where 2 faces meet. Edges are straight, they cannot be curved. Okay, so how many edges does this figure have? And so if we count them, you have 1, 2, 3, and then you got this one back here is 4, and 5, 6, 7, and 8. So you have 8 edges. Okay, so how many edges does my cell phone box have? Well, a good way to do this is just using some common sense and even basic multiplication. So if I think about the top of it, if you think about it, I have 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then if I have 4 on the top, I'm going to have 4 on the bottom. So that would be 8, and then I'm going to have the connecting ones. So 9, 10, 11, and 12. All right. So some figures do not have any edges because they do not have flat sides and the bases are curved. So think about cones and spheres and cylinders. Okay, they don't have any edges. Okay, so below is a cylinder. It has no flat sides and the bases are curved, so it has no edges. So the place where 2 or more edges meet is called a vertex, and this is important. A vertex is like a corner. It's pretty simple to think about. We can also count the number of vertices in order to identify solid figures. So let's go back to that idea of the cell phone box. How many vertices does it have? So you're looking for points. So you think about it, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you're going to have 7 and 8 down there where you can't see. Okay. In earlier math classes, you might have just called a figure a prism or a pyramid, but now we need to be more specific. So let's try one together. Okay, so let's look at this shape. So right now, think about what the figure is on the bases, or on the top and the bottom, right? So think about how many sides you have, okay? So first, you can see that each side is a polygon. Okay, that means that we're working with identifying some type of a prism. So let's use the base to help us identify this prism. Okay, so the base is a 5-sided figure. So we know that a 5-sided figure is called a pentagon. So this is a pentagonal prism, and we've talked about this one before. Okay, so when you think about the number of faces, edges, vertices, and edges in solid figures, you may start to see some patterns emerge. Okay, you can see one pattern in spheres, cones, and cylinders. So think about it. We've talked about it before. See if you can guess what it is. Okay, so to understand the pattern, you need to think about the number of faces, edges, and vertices each figure has. All of these figures are curved in some way, so they don't have so they have no edges or vertices. So what about their faces? So a sphere has no faces, a cone has 1 circular face, and a cylinder has 2 circular faces. Therefore, the number of faces increased by 1 from one figure to the next. Okay, so the pattern is 0, 1, 2 for sphere, cone, and cylinder. Okay, so what about prisms? Is there a pattern there? There is definitely a pattern with regard to prisms. As the number of sides in the base and the top parallel faces increases, the number of side faces increases to the same amount. Okay, so basically, if you think about it, if a triangular prism has 3 rectangles, a rectangular prism is going to have 4 rectangles, a pentagonal prism is going to have 5 rectangles, and then it's going to increase the faces. So it's like if a triangular prism has 2 triangles, then it would have 3 rectangles that connect those 2 triangles, giving it 5 faces. On the same idea, if you go all the way down to the octagonal prisms, if you have 2 octagons, well, that's 8 sides, so you can have 8 rectangles connecting it, and then you're going to have the 8 rectangles on the sides and the 2 octagons on one on the top, one on the bottom, to give you 10 total faces. Okay, so let's real quickly review and we'll wrap up this first review. Okay, so a face is a flat side of a solid figure. Faces are in the form of plane shapes, such as triangles, rectangles, and squares. An edge is a place where two faces meet. Edges are straight, they cannot be curved. Okay, and the place where two or more edges meet is called a vertex. All right, so tune in for the second part of the review to wrap up the rest of this chapter.